Hello, my friends. My name is Lorenz. I'm the co-founder of Sutra. Sutra is a social learning platform designed to help you create courses and communities that invite meaningful connection and conversation. In this video, I'm going to explore the age-old question of who am I? Maybe you've wrestled with this question, maybe you haven't, maybe you have an answer, maybe you don't. In this video, I'm going to share how this question has opened up for me and hopefully offer you some of my process that might somehow serve you. Now, the first thing I want to start with is a comment on how you might approach this question. In my experience working with other people with this question, I think it's really important to recognize that the things that might seem obvious are rarely obvious. And actually, it's that territory of obviousness that somehow offers the juiciest insights if you are willing to wrestle with what might feel like it's obvious, but actually may not be so obvious. And the second thing I'll add here is that in working with this inquiry of who am I, there has to be some amount of earnestness, right? You have to really look inside and recognize that you don't really have an answer. You might have an obvious answer like, oh, I am everything that's happened to me. I'm Lorenz. I am, there's a lot of obvious answers that come up, but very few that hold weight under scrutiny. And having a certain level of honesty about the internal confusion that might be there and a genuine curiosity, not like, oh, there's something wrong with me. I just don't get it. I'm not seeing it. This is hard. Yeah, it's hard. I want to be very, very clear about that. If you want to wrestle with this question of who am I, if it was easy and if you could even explain it, everyone would know and we wouldn't even be having this conversation. There'd be no reason for me to record this video. So I think it's very important to recognize that this is a question that people wrestle with for years. This is a question that I have wrestled with for years. And the invitation is to really come to a space of honest not knowing. I recently had a lengthy debate with someone who was giving me a lot of explanation about what he called ego, and I told him, I was like, I don't think you know what you're talking about. And he had all these very witty and intelligent responses to me, and then we kept digging and digging and digging and digging, and finally came to this question of who am I? And we kept digging and digging, and finally I was like, well, can you just answer the question? He was like, well, honestly, I don't know. And in that moment, that was like the most authentic answer that he gave me. I don't know. Right? From that point of not knowing, then you can begin to talk about ego and I and identity and all these things, right? But you have to get to this point of honesty and authenticity with yourself. I don't know, not knowing, right? And rather than that being something to avoid, well, of course I have to know who I am, and I have to have all these answers, and I have this idea of what an ego is because I've read all these spiritual books that tell me it's a bad thing and that I need to stop thinking and all this stuff, right? Like the reality of approaching an inquiry like who am I is that you are the only person that can answer it. You are the only person that can answer it. Nobody else can explain it to you. And that is the nature of the question. That is the nature of the answer as well, in that the answer is not something that you can explain, but it is something that you can know. That there are things that you can know that you cannot explain. The mystery of life is amazing. Right? There are things that you can know that you cannot explain. That's at the heart of this inquiry of who am I, right? So getting to that place that this might be a a challenging journey that you really don't know. Maybe you do, then you should stop watching this video, or maybe just see how I explain it, who knows. So that there's this authenticity with yourself. And then from that place of not knowing, right, just if you can get to that honest authenticity with yourself, like, I don't know, but there is this thing that's called I, that seems to be very real for me. It seems to be the center of my experience. I. Everything seems to revolve around I, and yet, I can't quite explain it, identify it, or point to it and articulate it and capture it, right? So that's what there is to become curious about, right? That's the power place of authenticity. I don't know, but there is something here that I am actually confused about. And recognizing that confusion is actually the beginning of clarity, right? You can be clear that there is confusion. I am clear that I'm confused about what this thing called I is. And that creates the grounds for meaningful curiosity, right? So I would say that this is the baseline to meaningfully begin to approach this question of who am I? This earnest honesty with yourself, right? So once we have that, right, I just want to create that as the condition and the foundation for the journey that we're going to embark on right now, that may or may not offer you anything, but that has been part of my process in answering this question for myself. So once we're there, I'm going to, or now that we're here, I'm going to share some reflections that you can sit with. And the first is just to look around and recognize that everything around you happens. Again, this might be something that's in the realm of obviousness, and we're going to be working with a lot of obviousness today, but everything around you happens. Right? So you're with a group of friends, they're having a conversation, they're drinking coffee or tea, that's something that is happening in the moment. And you come home and you interact with your partner or your kids or your family. That's something that happens. You're walking across the street, a car drives by in front of you. That is something that happens. You have a meal. That is something that happens. Everything around you is happening. And if you look at your whole life has been a series of happenings. There's never been anything around you that hasn't happened. And this obviously might seem obvious, but just notice that for a moment. Just notice that everything around you is happening. In this very moment, I am communicating with you through this video. This is happening, right? This is happening. And now notice that this thing that you might call I is always responding to what is happening. There has never been a moment in your life, ever, when this thing that you call I has not been in response to something that is happening. Just begin to notice that. Maybe if you want to question what I'm saying, try to think of any time in your life when there was something that wasn't in response to, right? And I also want to offer here that, there's what is happening externally, right? Everything that is happening. There's also what's happening internally. Thoughts, feelings, moods. Sometimes it might feel like those thoughts and feelings are also in response to, but sometimes they're just, you wake up and you're moody, you're upset, or you're cranky, or whatever. That's also a happening. Why do you wake up some days feeling great, some days you feel cranky? That is also something that you could say happens. You feel depressed, and that is also a version of a happening. So in that frame, just looking at everything that happens and noticing that somehow there is this thing that you call I, right? There's definitely a thing that in your life that is always present, that you that is somehow at the center of your experience that is called I. But if you look closely, the I is always in response. And in fact, there is never a moment in time when this I exists outside of response, outside of a response. And notice that. It might seem obvious, but if you sit with it, there are some really interesting things that begin to emerge out of that observation. This thing that is called I, if it's always responding to something that is happening, it is always a response to a happening, then isn't it also a happening? Doesn't this I happen? Doesn't this I happen? If there's all this stuff that's happening around me and there's this thing that's called I and it's always in response to what's happening, then is this I also not happening? But wait a second. I'm an I have all this agency and independence. I am an I don't happen. I'm an I. And just sit with that and just notice what comes up for you. And really wrestle with it. Really, you have to really wrestle with this inquiry because it's uncomfortable and all sorts of things that might come up. Well, of course I am my heart. I am, this deep spiritual cosmic being. I am this soul. And the point of this inquiry is to offer distinction, to offer clarity. Right? There's a distinction between this I am my heart, I am my soul, right? At the heart of all these things that we say, there is still a my, there is an I. There is something that there's an I and there's a my heart and there's a my body, there's all these things. So there's an I there. And that's really important to clarify in this conversation because we're talking about identifying exactly what that I is. And also possibly exploring the distinction between this thing that you might call I and this thing that you might call self. So there might be this thing that we call self, the awareness of the I. There's the awareness of what might be going on internally, your emotional state, your thoughts, your external circumstances. So there's always ever present an awareness there. And some people call this the I am. And in this video, I'm not going to get into so much the realm of that I am, but it's implicit in the conversation. It's just an inquiry to make distinct what is it that we most people most often refer to as I. This is a construct. This is something that is constructed. It's a happening. It's something that happens in response to what is happening. And this might not seem that profound, but if you sit with it, it becomes profound. It becomes an opening into a recognition that this thing that you call I only exists in relationship. In Ubuntu, there's a proverb that goes, I am because you are. And I find it's easy to take something like that on a conceptual level. I am because you are, we're having this interaction. But the profundity of that, the depth, and it's not just I am because you are another human being. It's that whatever I'm looking at in this moment, it happens to be the camera, that this thing that is called I only exists in relationship to this camera, to the lights, to this room. If I'm looking at a book or reading a book, this thing that I call I only exists as a response to that. And of course, if I'm with a person, that this thing that I call I never, ever exists in a way that isn't in response to something. And if you actually look really closely to that, you might recognize or notice or somehow discover that that thing called I actually doesn't really exist. It doesn't really exist. This thing that you call I, if you just look really, really closely, you'll see that there is existence. There's no debate about that. There might be, but that's not the purpose of this video. There is existence, and there is stuff that happens, and there is the experience of I. There is this I construct that happens, that occurs inside of this existence, and there is your awareness of that I. There can be your awareness of that I. And here we could get super loopy, because even in that awareness of that I, the awareness of that I occurs through that I. So it's kind of like the I construct becoming aware of itself. So it still occurs through that frame. Maybe you could get outside that frame, but it's a pretty big frame. I'm not quite there to share whether or not how you might get outside that frame. But noticing that frame is already a pretty significant shift in one's relationship to oneself and reality. In yogic philosophy, you have this term Sat Chit Ananda. Sat is existence, is the nature of everything around you. Chit is consciousness, consciousness of that existence. And Ananda is bliss. It is the delight of experience. So how is that relevant to what we're talking about? Well, noticing the I construct becomes an entry point into awareness. Just becoming aware that there is an experience, there is something that's happening, there is a response to that, there is an I that is constructed around that, and that I is something that occurs in the space. It's also a happening. It isn't necessarily who you are. And in fact, when you look really, really closely, this thing that you call I doesn't exist in the way that you think you do. It doesn't contain all these inadequacies or deficiencies or things that are good or bad about it. There's just nothing there. There's just nothing there. There's just existence and the consciousness of that existence. And if you recognize that, okay, that's great, but what do I do with that? And if you begin to recognize that as a practice, and notice everything's all like great as long as everything's great. It's really the when things feel challenging, that there's an opportunity to work with some of this at a deeper level, right? You encounter a family member or a person that's frustrating you and challenging you. So let's play with that. Let's say there's a person that's challenging you or somehow frustrating you. And recognize I am because you are. So that this thing that I call I, right? I'm me, I'm this independent agency, only exists in response to you. This frustration that comes up only exists as a response. Now, the twist here is that if I love myself, and maybe not all of us can maybe that's challenging or whatever, right? But let's assume that we all love ourselves. I really want to offer that to all of us, that there's a genuine love there, that I love myself, this thing that I call I. I love myself, because what else is there to do with life besides love yourself, right? That if I love myself, then this version of myself is only showing up in response to you, to the person frustrating me. Like this I only exists, like these aspects of I only exist in response. There is no, like if this was gone, if you, the person that's frustrating me, is gone, not there, then this thing that I'm calling I doesn't exist either. You cannot separate the two. I am because you are. You cannot separate the two. They only exist as a response to each other. And if you recognize that, if you can really be with that, the only response is love. The only response is love. And that love, the recognition of that love offers an entry point into the bliss, into the ananda, into the being with life. Because this thing that we call life, obviously it's a mystery. But this thing that I call I, also a mystery, but it's one that we can begin to recognize the edges of, that there is something here that's constructed as a response to what is happening. And if you're still wrestling with this, I'll offer you another entry point into it. Let's say you're having an amazing day. You're so happy. Everything is awesome. You come home and everyone around you is miserable. And they're just like piling up on you, giving you shit, just like the worst. What happens to your internal state? Right? You're probably going to be miserable. If the closest people around you are miserable, you're going to be miserable, most likely, unless you're totally impervious to that kind of thing. Now let's flip that situation. Let's say you wake up and you're feeling so miserable, you're feeling so heavy and sad, and you wake up and you step outside and your family, they're just so attuned to you. They're so present and attentive, and they're just nurturing you and taking care of you in the right way, not in a way that's suffocating or overbearing or trying to make you different. They're just present. What happens to your internal state? All of a sudden you feel uplifted, you feel held, you feel supported. So where is this independent I that is not a response to what is happening either internally or externally? Again, this might seem obvious, but there's something here to wrestle with, to discover, because sitting with this, and maybe in the process of sitting with it, things will come up. You might feel angry or rejected or sad or no, like this doesn't, like I'm me, this is silly and it's stupid. And the thing to recognize, to just look closely at, is the level of clarity that you feel there. Right? When you say I am me or I am my heart or whatever it is, who is the I there? Who is the my? Can you clearly articulate it to yourself in a way that you know with absolute clarity what it is that you're talking about? And if there's some confusion there, then to not push that away as something that shouldn't be there, or no, like I know this, I know the answer to this question, because it's okay not to know. And it is that not knowing that is the beginning of a meaningful inquiry into what it is that we're talking about. And getting there, even getting to that place of not knowing, can be really painful. Can be really, really painful because we're conditioned to know. We're conditioned to have the answer to these questions that should be obvious. Of course I know who I am. Of course I know what this thing called ego is. Of course, right? But to get to the starting point of that inquiry of actually, I don't know. I know what people have told me. I know what I've read. I've, been to all these lectures. But personally, myself, as a direct experience, I don't know. That honesty, that authenticity, you don't have to tell anyone else. You don't have to, just with yourself, right? That not knowing is the beginning. And as you're wrestling and you have these answers coming up or frustrations or whatever, just recognizing that and that making that okay, but also recognizing that as stuff is coming up, you still don't quite know. And you may never have an answer that you can explain to another person. However, there is something to know. There is a knowing there. This is an answer that you can have a knowing of, a clarity with, even if you can't explain it. And that's the point of this inquiry. That's what we're exploring here. And that's what I've offered you today as part of the path or the building blocks that have supported me in this journey as this question has opened up for me in a deep way, and also offered me a much richer connection to life. Because again, what's the practical value of this? The practical value of being able to clearly see, having a clear awareness of your I construct is simply that, is that you can recognize it for what it is, something that is there, something that happens, and at the same time, something that doesn't need to define my response to what is happening. And that is agency and independence. That is the gift of awareness, that there may be whatever is there, may be whatever emotions and thoughts and feelings and inclinations and orientations, all of that may well be there, and that is something that can be in the space of my awareness, and that I can have a relationship to. I can have a relationship to this I construct. This I construct has a relationship and is in response to all of these other things, and that's fine. But the awareness of that makes all the difference in my capacity to respond to life, to live life in a very different way than if I am completely consumed and identified with this I construct that happens. All right, my friends, that was deep. I hope that was helpful. I hope it offers you some sort of value or insight. I invite you to wrestle with this for a moment or two if you feel called to. Feel free to leave your comments and reflections below. I would love to hear from you and your own journey with this thing called I. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe. If you know anyone else who would receive value from this reflection, please share the video with them. Thank you so much for watching. Much love.